Bonnet. Now, first of all, I guess, okay, if there was a typical pirate, he would be probably a sailor. He would be pretty poor. His life expectancy would not be great. He'd be probably, if he would either have been a privateer at some point in his life, just been a privateer, or a merchant sailor either on slavers or in the East India Company or something like that. That's your typical pirate. Even the ones that became captains usually had that kind of background. Tell us why Stede Bonnet breaks that mold.
Stede, bless him, is not any of that. He was not a tall man. He was not particularly well built. He was not the strong, kind of sinewy type that you would expect to have been on a boat because he was a landsman. Stede was a third generation plantation owner in Barbados. He inherited at a very young age after his parents died about 400 acres of sugar plantation that included the mills, the animals necessary to run those, the human labor, the slave labor. So he was, provided a liberal education as a child. He had everything he could possibly want, and eventually took over this plantation. He married well, married a young lady named Mary Allenby, who was the daughter of another wealthy landowner in Barbados. And they must have lived a life very much like those of the London elite at the time. They ate well, they drank well, they drank Madeira wines and ciders and rum drinks, had a lot of lemonade. So they ate well, but it certainly feels like that just wasn't enough for Bonnet.
So in other words, this man was a gentleman.
Absolutely. In almost every sense of the word, he was a gentleman, both in his upbringing, kind of the aristocratic gentleman style, but also in the way that he interacted with people. He did develop a reputation of being very likable. And I think that that's an interesting and key component, particularly as it relates to Blackbeard. It's not one that's been explored much. But yeah, even when Colonel Rhett captured him, which we'll get to and talk about shortly, Rhett offered to take him to England and to have his trial and his appeal, the appeal his death sentence there. So
which is an excellent point, and we must really remember to go back to that, because most pirates would not have been even considered that offer. But this man is in no way near like the other pirates of this era, or he's a little, I guess, like some of the buccaneers who were sent out or who managed to get enough capital to go out.
Sure.
But even then, he's not a sailor.
That's right.
He's not a seaman.
Yeah, the buccaneers were, as I understand it, kind of hardened landsmen, right?
They were at least soldiers and stuff.
That's right. Yeah, they would smoke their own meats. They would live on the land when they could. But Bonnet was in a fitted woolen overcoat, right? He had this tricorn cocked hat, he had a wig on, silk stockings. He has heeled shoes. In fact, the wood carvings that you see, he's got these leather pointed toes with gold buttons. I mean, he would have stood out tremendously against these kind of tall, salted men of the wharves and shipyards and taverns. So absolutely.
But he reminds me. What? Sorry.
I was going to say, he did have something that others may not have had, in that he did operate a sugar plantation. He had a business acumen. He knew about money. He didn't necessarily just take money and blow it on prostitutes, right? He invested in his own ship. He knew when provisions were necessary. So, in my mind, he kind of knew when there were outbreaks of disease what to do, for example. So he did have a skill set that may not have perfectly aligned with piracy, but that I think is part of his story, really adds some depth to what happened. We'll talk about some of his specific, engagements. And I think that piece of it, the fact that he owned a plantation, he was responsible for the health of others, and had to oversee a workforce, let's say, which is probably the nicest possible way to say that.
Yeah.
He was responsible for those and knew how to use people for his gain. And I think that
Hmm.
ultimately that contributed to his relative success.
Indeed. A couple of things we want to mention on that score is that, success is relative when it comes to pirates.
Okay.
There was a lot of pirates that we don't know the names of who either surrendered, retired, were killed, things like that. Not all of them ended up on a gallows. So had the end turned out differently, maybe Stede Bonnet might have been one of these guys. But obviously, as fate would have it, things went differently. He reminds me a little, actually. You know how people make fun of the old Hollywood pirates, the Errol Flynn gentleman archetype, swashbuckler. He's a little like that, you know,
That's right.
i.e., nothing like the other famous guys. Another reason that he is set apart is the way he got his ship.
Yep.
The general way that pirates would get their ships would be that they would either already be the captain of a privateering vessel,
Yep.
they would mutiny and take a vessel that they were on, and then, due to the egalitarian nature of pirate societies, they would elect a chain of officers. And then there were the ones who would set out in a canoe and just capture a bigger ship and then go on from there.
That's right.
Stede didn't do this because he was rich.
Yeah, he had a certain privilege that very few other pirates had. You're absolutely right. Stede went out, and the record is a little bit unclear on exactly how he got it, whether he built it from scratch, which I don't think happened, or whether he purchased an existing ship, which is, in my book, I describe, I think is how it occurred. The record is becoming more clear as people are doing more and more research, and it appears you're absolutely right. Bonnet went out. He took a loan at some point for a good amount of money, and eventually purchased a ship, we think, a sloop, called the Revenge. The name, we think, pre-existed Bonnet's ownership of it. So he bought a ship from somebody that had come down from Rhode Island to Barbados, purchased the ship called the Revenge, and set out to kind of fill his crew out. He certainly had it fitted with additional cannons, and hired a crew of about 125, 126 other sailors, and set out, kind of under the cover of darkness, we think, without telling anybody else. In fact, there is a clearing schedule that's kept at the time and shows that in either April or May of 1717, Bonnet, kind of left. The Revenge left without clearing, which means he didn't check with the customs officials before he went. So you're absolutely right. He either bought or built a ship, fitted it out, hired a crew, spent his own money. In fact, you talked about the egalitarian nature of pirates, and normally they would get together and elect their captain. Of course, Bonnet would not be who they chose, and Bonnet, I think, rather intelligently paid his crew a wage rather than paying them out of their spoils.
Mm-hmm.
And that assured him that he would be captain of the ship, at least until his money ran out.
It's one of the many fascinating things about Stede Bonnet is how he became a pirate, which is pretty much he woke up one day and decided I'm going to be a pirate.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, it is, like you were saying at the beginning, a weirdly attractive,
Sure,
glamorous almost pursuit.
Right.
Even back then.
Yeah.
He is proof, actually, Stede Bonnet is actual proof that people then kind of saw pirates the way people see them now.
That's right. Yeah, or at least piracy. And I think Bonnet was relatively unique. So there's a couple of things to mention there. First of all, he lived in Barbados, which is one of the windwardmost islands, right? So it's one of the very first places people stop when they come into the Caribbean. But once you get west of it, because of the way that the winds blow and other things, it's very difficult to get back without kind of looping back up and around and through. So he lives in what I'm going to call kind of a protected area. It's not one that was visited much by pirates. There are some stories of pirates that made their way to Barbados, but most of the piracy that occurred happened elsewhere. Now, the other piece of that is Bonnet, as we've already talked about, had a liberal education. So he knew how to read. And there is indications that he even carried a library on board his ship. And I think that that's an important part of his desire to go pirating, is that, there was a group of voyage narratives at the time, right? So folks like Lionel Wafer and others, William Dampier, had kind of circumnavigated the globe, and they were producing these books about their stories. And they've got the stories of Alexander Selkirk, who had been marooned on islands, and they've got stories of the Indian Ocean and other things. And Bonnet, who had been relatively sheltered on this island of Barbados, must have read these stories and said, "Wow, there's so much more out there. How do I see that?" And I think you're absolutely right. He was drawn to piracy for the same reasons that some of us are from tales of Treasure Island and other things.
Yeah.
It's adventure and it's wanderlust. And if you listen to Captain Johnson from the General History of the Pirates, it's probably a little bit of having a home life that was not particularly good. Johnson, and I think most historians at this point understand that Johnson's stories are highly embellished and, probably don't have a full picture of what happened at the time. But it is, some of the facts do check out. And one of the facts about Bonnet that they describe is that he had what Johnson called disorders in his marital estate, or in his marital state. So he had issues at home. People love to focus on that. They call Mary Allenby a nagging wife, and things like that. But I'm not necessarily sure that's the full story either. But I would imagine that contributed to Bonnet's desire to just get out.
I mean, stories like that are plausible, and even if they're not plausible in reality, they might have been plausible in his reality. She may have been a perfectly fine, normal wife, but he looking for something more may have found her domesticity, I suppose, just intolerable, because he was an odd guy. People like this don't do this sort of thing. If they want to, they join the army, they join the navy, they go adventuring somewhere, explore new lands. They don't actually go with the intention of becoming a pirate and stealing on the high seas.
That's right. And once they get there, they don't walk around the deck in a silk nightgown and talk to themselves holding a book in their library. There are a number of historical record references to Bonnet that just, gives you an insight that, hey, he might not have been completely sane, we'll say. And, even Johnson described his marital state as causing a, quote, disorder in his mind. And I think that's probably a piece of it too, right? Bonnet just, for whatever reason, whether it was based on how he grew up or the circumstances we described in Barbados already, he just wasn't all there. And, and it takes a little bit of crazy, I think, to buy a ship and to do this, because he didn't know what he was doing. And a sane, rational person would have stopped 100 times and said, this is not the right thing. And
so, he was obviously we've got a picture of a guy here, of an interesting guy here. He may not be completely all there, but he's driven. Yep. He has the capability to be a leader. It's not unusual for people with no sea experience to be commanding ships. It happened earlier in the 17th century. You'd have soldiers being told, you just become an admiral today and command this fleet. So it's not too unusual for the time. It's becoming more unusual, but it's not too unusual.
Sure.
And so why don't we, as time is moving on, we jump into kind of his career and how sort of just a general
absolutely
course of his career.
Well, viewer, that's all from the Castle of Madness that is the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel for now. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like below, subscribe, tell me what you thought in the comments, what hats you like, what hats and history do you like, and I will see you in the next episode. Via con Dios.